It was a day like any other, or so Clara Mendes thought. A muffled thump echoed through the pristine hallway of the SEO Hotel's exclusive presidential suite floor, shattering the luxurious silence she'd grown so used to. Pushing her cleaning cart, Clara froze. Something wasn't right. The sound wasn't the usual clatter of a dropped glass or the faint hum of a guest's television. No, this was heavier, darker, something primal that gripped her gut and wouldn't let go. She hesitated, her knuckles hovering over the polished door. "Sir, is everything okay in there?" she called, her voice trembling slightly as she adjusted her apron. Silence. Deafening, suffocating silence. She knocked again, harder this time, her heart starting to pound. "Don't make me break down this door. I'm not strong enough for that, but the manager won't like it," she warned, half joking, half pleading. Still nothing. With a sigh that masked her growing unease, Clara fumbled for the master key in her pocket. Her hand shook as she turned it in the lock, the click sounding like a gunshot in the stillness. The door swung open, and what she saw stopped her cold. There, sprawled on the floor, was a man whose face she'd seen plastered across magazines and billboards. Leonardo Vasconcelos, the billionaire tycoon, the untouchable titan of technology, lay pale and sweating, his breath shallow and ragged. His eyes were half open, unfocused, teetering on the edge of oblivion. Clara's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she gasped, the words tumbling out as her instincts kicked in. This wasn't just a guest in distress. This was a man dangling by a thread over the abyss of death. Clara wasn't just a chambermaid. Years ago, in the chaotic emergency rooms of Brazil, she'd been a nurse, trained to act when seconds meant the difference between life and a cold, empty shell. That training surged back now, electrifying her veins. She dropped to her knees beside him, her fingers pressing against his neck. His pulse was faint, irregular, a whisper of life slipping away. "Okay, big guy, let's save your life," she muttered, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. With precise, practiced movements, she unbuttoned his shirt, exposing his chest, and began chest compressions. "1, 2, 3, don't give up now, man. You must have a jet to pay for tomorrow, don't you?" she said, her tone laced with grim humor as she pressed down, counting each beat. Her arms ached, her breaths came in sharp gasps, but she didn't stop. 30 compressions, then a tilt of his head, opening his airway. She leaned in, her lips brushing his as she forced air into his lungs. "You won't die here, Leonardo Vasconcelos. Don't even think about it," she grunted, her determination a blazing fire. Minutes stretched into eternity, each second a battle against the inevitable. Sweat beaded on her forehead, her muscles screamed, but she kept going. This wasn't just a job anymore. This was a war she refused to lose. Then faintly, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Relief flooded her, but she didn't falter. Not yet. She kept pumping, kept breathing for him until the paramedics burst through the door. They took over, their movements swift and professional, and Clara stepped back, her legs trembling, her chest heaving. One of them turned to her, his eyes wide with respect. "You saved his life. Without your quick actions, he wouldn't have made it." Clara nodded, too exhausted to speak, watching as they loaded Leonardo onto a stretcher and whisked him away. She sank against the wall, staring at the now empty suite. The spotless luxury mocked her, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. "I just wanted to finish my shift in peace," she muttered, a wry smile tugging at her lips, but peace was the last thing she'd get. What Clara didn't know, what no one could have predicted, was that this moment, this single, earth-shattering act had set off a chain of events that would unravel her life and his in ways too wild, too emotional, too scandalous to fathom. The man she'd saved wasn't just a billionaire. He was a force that would pull her into a storm she never saw coming. And as Leonardo's stretcher disappeared down the hall, Clara had no idea that she'd just stepped into the eye of a hurricane, one that would expose secrets, ignite passions, and rewrite destinies. This wasn't just a rescue. This was the beginning of something so much bigger, something that would leave the world gasping. But for now, she stood there alone, catching her breath, unaware of the tidal wave about to crash over her. Leonardo Vasconcelos opened his eyes to a world he didn't recognize. The sterile glow of hospital lights stabbed at his vision, and the steady beep of machines tethered him to a reality he couldn't control. For a man who'd built an empire on precision and power, this vulnerability was a nightmare. He tried to sit up, but a sharp pain in his chest pinned him back. A nurse appeared, her voice calm but firm. "Mr. Vasconcelos, please don't move. You've had a serious event." Serious? His voice rasped, hoarse and weak, a shadow of the commanding tone that had silenced boardrooms. "What happened?" "A heart attack," the nurse replied, adjusting the monitors. "You're very lucky. Someone at the hotel started resuscitation before we arrived. That saved your life." Leonardo blinked, confusion clouding his mind. Who did this? Someone from the board? A guest? His world was one of power plays and high stakes. Surely it was someone important, someone he'd crossed paths with in his ruthless climb to the top. The nurse smiled faintly, almost amused. "No, it was a maid." "A maid?" He repeated the word as if it were alien, his brow furrowing in disbelief. The idea was absurd, ludicrous even. A cleaning worker. Someone he'd never have glanced at twice. He sank back against the pillow, his mind racing. This wasn't how his story was supposed to go. He'd always trusted elite doctors, cutting-edge medicine, the best money could buy. And now he owed his life to a stranger in an apron. Meanwhile, Clara Mendes sat in the hospital lobby, still in her hotel uniform, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She hadn't planned to come here. She didn't want recognition, didn't want thanks. She just needed to know he was okay, that the man whose life she'd fought for hadn't slipped away after all. Sitting on a hard bench, she watched the bustle of nurses and patients, her mind replaying the chaos of the suite. "He's fine. That's what matters," she whispered to herself, pushing a strand of hair behind her ear. But something gnawed at her, a restless itch she couldn't shake. She'd saved him, yes, but walking away felt incomplete. She needed closure, needed to see him, even if just from a distance. She told herself it was nothing more, just a loose end to tie up. But deep down, something stirred, a curiosity, a pull she couldn't name. Back in his hospital bed, Leonardo wrestled with the nurse's words. A maid. The phrase echoed, taunting him. He'd spent decades building walls, walls of wealth, status, control. Yet here he was, humbled by someone he'd never have noticed. It grated on him, this debt to an invisible savior. But it also sparked something, a flicker of intrigue in a man who thought he'd seen it all. The next day he returned to the hotel, his body still weak but his posture reclaiming its usual arrogance. He stopped at reception to adjust his stay, his mind still churning. That's when he saw her, Clara, pushing her cleaning cart through the lobby. She kept her head down, avoiding his gaze, but her heart skipped a beat. She knew who he was. She felt his pulse falter beneath her hands. Leonardo, though, didn't know her, not yet. But something about her caught his eye, a vague familiarity he couldn't place. "Excuse me," he called, surprising even himself. Clara stopped, turning slowly, her expression guarded. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You look familiar. Have we seen each other before?" he asked, his tone probing. Clara bit back a laugh, her calm masking the absurdity of the moment. "Of course, sir. I'm the one who cleans up your mess, literally." He stared at her, speechless, her words hanging in the air. Then he shook his head, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "I understand, thank you." She nodded and moved on, leaving him standing there, watching her go. That brief exchange lit a spark in him, a curiosity that refused to fade. Who was this woman? Why did she unsettle him? Leonardo Vasconcelos wasn't a man who let questions linger. He'd built his fortune on answers, on control. And now this maid, this enigma, had slipped into his orbit, challenging everything he thought he knew. Later that afternoon, as Clara changed the linens in another suite, Leonardo appeared in the doorway. He leaned against the frame, arms crossed, his gaze piercing. "Do you always work with such determination?" he asked, his tone casual but loaded. She glanced up, startled, but quickly recovered. "Determination," she echoed, folding a sheet with deliberate care. "This is just practice. These rooms don't clean themselves." He stepped closer, studying her. "There's something about you, Something that makes me think this isn't all you've ever done. You're different." Her stomach twisted, but she kept her smile. "Maybe I just have a special talent for making beds, Mr. Vasconcelos," she said, deflecting with a lightness she didn't feel. He narrowed his eyes, sensing the dodge but didn't push. Not yet. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that every word, every glance was pulling him deeper into a mystery he'd soon unravel. Clara wasn't just a maid. She was the woman who'd yanked him back from death's grip. And that truth, when it hit him, would shatter his world and hers, in ways neither could predict. Leonardo Vasconcelos wasn't a man who left loose ends. That night, alone in his suite, he sat with a glass of untouched whiskey, his mind restless. Clara's face, her calm, her quiet defiance haunted him. There was something there, something he couldn't let go. As a man of power, he had resources at his fingertips, and he intended to use them. Logging into the hotel's security system, a perk of his status, he pulled up the footage from the day of his heart attack. He adjusted the timeline, his pulse quickening as the screen flickered to life. There she was, Clara Mendes entering the suite, her movements swift and sure. The video captured it all, her checking his pulse, her hands pressing against his chest, her breaths forcing life back into him. He watched transfixed as she fought against time, her face tense with focus, her hands trembling as she stepped aside for the paramedics. The recording ended and Leonardo paused it, staring at her frozen image. His breath caught. This wasn't just a maid. This was his savior. The realization hit him like a freight train. The woman he'd dismissed, the one he'd barely acknowledged, had been the difference between life and death. Shame crept in, hot and bitter. He treated her like she was nothing, less than nothing. And yet she'd given him everything. His empire, his jets, his billions, they'd meant nothing in that moment. It was her hands, her resolve, that had pulled him back. The next morning, he found her in the hallway, pushing her cart as if nothing had changed. But everything had. He stopped in front of her, his expression softer, unguarded. "I saw what you did for me," he said, his voice low but firm. Clara blinked, her heart racing. She tried to play it off, forcing calm into her words. "What do you mean?" "There's no need to pretend," he replied, his gaze locking with hers. "Cameras don't lie." Her throat tightened, a lump forming as she swallowed hard. She wanted to stay anonymous, to let this fade into the background. But now, here he was, peeling back her secret. "I wasn't expecting thanks, if that's what you want to know," she said, a hint of defiance breaking through her vulnerability. Leonardo's lips curved into a small, restrained smile. "Maybe you didn't expect them, but that doesn't mean you don't deserve them." She held his gaze, her composure unwavering despite the storm inside. This wasn't how she'd imagined it, standing toe-to-toe with a billionaire, her act of courage laid bare. But there was no running now. That night, Leonardo lay awake, the footage replaying in his mind. Each time he saw her determination, her fearlessness, a tidal wave of emotions crashed over him. Gratitude, yes, but something deeper, something unsettling. It was humbling, this debt to someone he'd overlooked. And yet it wasn't just humility stirring in him. It was admiration, discomfort, a crack in the armor he'd worn for decades. The next morning, he sought her out again. She was cleaning a window, her movements methodical when he approached. "Did you come to inspect the cleanliness?" she asked, her voice dripping with sarcasm, masking her unease. "Actually, I came to thank you," he said, his sincerity cutting through her defenses. Clara froze, the cloth slipping from her hand. "To thank me," she repeated, disbelief thick in her tone. "I thought that wasn't in your repertoire, Mr. Vasconcelos." He took a breath, the weight of his words pressing down. "It's not something I do often, I admit, but that doesn't mean I don't recognize what you did. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here." She studied him, silent, her face unreadable. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer but firm. "I just did what anyone would do. You don't need to turn it into something big." "No," he countered, his tone almost a whisper. "It wasn't just what anyone would do. You went above and beyond, and I was an idiot." The air thickened with silence, his confession hanging between them. Clara's eyes softened, the hardness melting away. "Well, we're on the same page there," she said, a brief, genuine smile breaking through. He returned it, but his expression carried a depth she couldn't decipher. "Why didn't you say anything?" he asked, his voice introspective. "You could have used it, asked for a promotion, anything." Her laugh was light, unexpected. "Because that wasn't my purpose, Mr. Vasconcelos. I didn't do it to gain something. I did it because it was right." Her words struck him, piercing through years of cynicism. "And because of that, I feel worse about how I treated you," he admitted, his gaze dropping. "I'm not used to owing someone, especially not someone I've treated as badly as you." Clara sighed, her tone gentle now. "Everyone deserves a second chance, even you." He looked up, surprised by the clarity in her voice. For the first time, he saw her, not as a maid, not as an employee, but as a person. A person with strength, integrity, wisdom he'd never bothered to notice. "You're a better person than I imagined," he said, stepping back. "I hope one day I can repay you." "Just take care of your life," she replied softly. "That'll be enough." As he walked away, her words settled over him like a quiet revelation. Something had shifted, something fundamental. For the first time in years, Leonardo Vasconcelos felt the stirrings of change. And Clara, she just planted a seed that would grow into something neither of them could escape, a connection that would soon explode into a scandalous, emotional firestorm. The sun dipped low over the hotel's private garden, casting a warm golden hue across the blooming jasmine and roses. Clara Mendes sat on a wooden bench beside Leonardo Vasconcelos, the billionaire whose life she'd saved just weeks ago. The air was thick with the scent of flowers, but beneath the tranquil scene, a quiet tension simmered. Leonardo's dark eyes studied her, softer now than the commanding gaze she'd first encountered in the hotel lobby. He'd changed since that day, since the heart attack that nearly claimed him, and Clara felt the shift in every word, every glance. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Leonardo said, his voice low and tentative, a stark contrast to the decisive tone he used in boardrooms. "Why did you leave nursing? You were clearly good at it, better than good. You saved my life." Clara's breath hitched. She'd anticipated this question, dreaded it even, but there was no escaping it now. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the bench, and she averted her gaze to the horizon, where the sky bled orange and pink. "It's a long story," she whispered, her voice fragile, barely audible over the rustling leaves. "I've got time," he replied, gentle but firm. He leaned closer, his presence steady, urging her to open the door she'd kept locked for so long. Clara exhaled, a shaky breath that carried years of buried pain. "I lost someone," she began, her words trembling like leaves in a storm. "A patient, a little girl named Lily. She was only 7. I was her nurse for months. She had leukemia. I did everything I could, stayed late, researched treatments, held her hand when she was scared. But one night she crashed. I tried to save her, but it wasn't enough. She died on my watch." Tears welled in her eyes, and she blinked them back fiercely. "After that, I couldn't face it. The guilt, the fear of failing again, it broke me. So I left nursing and became a maid where no one's life depended on me." Leonardo's chest tightened at the raw pain in her voice. He reached out, his hand enveloping hers, warm and grounding. "I'm so sorry," he said, his tone thick with empathy. "I can't imagine carrying that. But Clara, you didn't fail me. You pulled me back from the brink when no one else could." She met his gaze, her eyes glistening. "Maybe," she murmured, "but it doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't bring Lily back." "No," he agreed softly, "but it proves you're still a healer even if you don't see it. You're not just a maid, you're the woman who gave me a second chance." A small, bittersweet smile tugged at Clara's lips. "I don't know about that. I'm not sure who I am anymore." "You're more than you realize," Leonardo insisted, his grip tightening. "And you're making me see things differently, see myself differently." Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. They wandered the city together, exploring hidden art galleries, strolling through sun-dappled parks, and sharing quiet dinners in tucked-away bistros. Clara learned of Leonardo's relentless climb to wealth, the sacrifices he'd made, and the isolation that shadowed his success. He discovered her quiet passion for helping others, her dream of a community health clinic, and the resilience that had carried her through loss. Each conversation peeled back another layer, binding them closer. But as their bond grew, so did the whispers of trouble. One evening, as they left a cozy restaurant, a man in a tailored suit intercepted them. "Mr. Vasconcelos," he said, his voice clipped and formal. "I represent the board. We're concerned about your recent distractions." Leonardo's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing. "What concerns?" he demanded, his tone sharp as a blade. The man's gaze flicked to Clara, cool and assessing. "Your relationship with Ms. Mendes. It's causing talk among investors, the press. We suggest you reconsider." Clara's stomach twisted, a wave of doubt crashing over her. She'd feared this, her presence tainting his world. But Leonardo stepped forward, his voice low and lethal. "My personal life is none of your business. If the board has an issue, they can face me directly." The man nodded curtly and retreated, but the encounter left a mark. That night in Leonardo's suite, Clara sat on the couch, her hands trembling. "Maybe they're right," she said, her voice breaking. "Maybe I'm not good for you. I don't want to ruin everything you've built." Leonardo knelt before her, taking her hands in his. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me," he said, his eyes fierce with conviction. "Don't let them make you doubt that. We'll face this together." She wanted to believe him, to cling to his strength, but fear gnawed at her. Then her phone buzzed, shattering the moment. She glanced at it, her face paling. An unknown number. The message was stark. "You don't belong here. Leave or you'll regret it." "What is it?" Leonardo asked, his voice tight with concern. She handed him the phone, her hands shaking. "Someone wants me gone," she whispered. His expression darkened, a storm brewing in his eyes. "We'll find out who sent this," he vowed, "and they'll answer to me." As he pulled her into his arms, Clara felt the warmth of his resolve, but the chill of the threat lingered. The storm was coming, and she wasn't sure they could weather it. Clara awoke to a nightmare she couldn't escape. Her face stared back at her from every newsstand, every screen, tabloid headlines blaring. Billionaire's secret romance with hotel maid, and gold digger or true love. The articles twisted her life into a caricature, dredging up her past as a nurse, speculating about her motives. She sat on the edge of Leonardo's bed, her phone trembling in her hands as she scrolled through the vitriol. The invasion was suffocating, stripping her bare for the world to judge. Leonardo found her there, her eyes red-rimmed and distant. "Clara," he said softly, sitting beside her, "don't read that trash. None of it's true." "But it's everywhere," she whispered, her voice cracking. "They're saying I'm using you, that I'm not good enough. And maybe they're right, maybe I don't belong in your world." He cupped her face, his thumbs brushing away her tears. "They're wrong," he said, his voice fierce. "You're everything to me. Don't let them tear us apart." But the media storm was relentless. Paparazzi swarmed the hotel, their cameras flashing like vultures circling prey. Anonymous texts flooded Clara's phone, "Leave him or else," each one a dagger to her fragile peace. And the fallout reached beyond them. Leonardo's empire began to crumble. Investors withdrew, deals collapsed, and the board's murmurs grew into a roar. One afternoon, Leonardo stormed into his office, the door slamming behind him. "This is unacceptable," he growled, packing like a caged lion. "They're harassing her, digging into her life. I won't let it stand." His assistant, Maria, looked up from her desk, her face etched with worry. "Sir, the board's called an emergency meeting. They want answers about her, about the company." "Let them demand," he snapped. "I'll deal with them." But the pressure weighed heavily, and Clara saw the strain in his eyes, the sleepless nights etched into his features. She felt like a curse, unraveling his life thread by thread. Then one evening, as she walked home from the hotel, a shadow fell over her. Footsteps echoed behind her, quickening as she did. Panic surged and she broke into a run, but a hand seized her arm, spinning her around. It was Marco, her ex-boyfriend, the man who'd shattered her trust years ago. His eyes glinted with malice, his smirk cold. "Saw you in the news," he sneered. "Climbed the ladder, huh? But I know your secrets, Clara. I know why you really left nursing." Her blood froze. "What do you want?" she demanded, wrenching her arm free. "Money," he said, leaning closer. "Lots of it, or I tell the world what you did, how you let that girl die." "It's a lie," she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "I did everything I could for Lily." "Did you?" he taunted. "Or did you screw up? The tabloids will eat it up either way." Clara fled, her heart pounding as she raced to Leonardo's suite. She collapsed into his arms, sobs racking her body. "He's back," she choked out. "Marco, he's threatening to ruin me." Leonardo's face hardened, his arms tightening around her. "He won't touch you," he vowed. "I'll handle him." But the threats escalated. The media hounded them relentlessly, the board's ultimatums loomed, and Marco's shadow darkened every step. One night, as they sat together, Clara broke. "I can't do this," she sobbed, tears streaming down her face. "The press, the threats, your company, it's all falling apart because of me." Leonardo pulled her close, his voice steady. "None of this is your fault," he said. "We'll get through it together, I promise." But promises couldn't stop the inevitable. Late that night, Leonardo's phone rang, shattering the fragile silence. He answered, his face draining of color as he listened. "What is it?" Clara asked, dread coiling in her gut. "It's the board," he said, his voice hollow. "They've given me an ultimatum: end our relationship or lose my position as CEO." Clara's world spun. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You can't choose me over everything you've built." He looked at her, his eyes blazing with a fire she'd never seen. "Watch me," he said, and in that moment she knew he meant it. The boardroom was a crucible of silence, every eye fixed on Leonardo Vasconcelos as he stood at the head of the polished mahogany table. The air crackled with tension, the weight of his words still reverberating through the room. The board members, men and women in pristine suits, their faces a gallery of shock and indignation, sat frozen, grappling with what they'd just heard. Leonardo's posture was unyielding, his dark eyes steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. "I've made my decision," he said, his voice ringing with unshakable resolve. "I choose Clara. I choose love over power, over wealth, over this company. You can have it, I don't need it anymore." The silence shattered. Voices erupted, overlapping in a cacophony of disbelief and anger. "You're throwing away decades of work," one shouted. "This is reckless, irresponsible," cried another, but Leonardo didn't waver. He turned and walked out, the heavy door closing behind him with a finality that echoed in his bones. As he stepped into the hallway, a strange lightness settled over him. For the first time in years, the chains of expectation fell away. He was free. But freedom came with a price. The media descended like a plague, headlines screaming, "Billionaire abandons empire for love," and Vasconcelos' fall from grace. They painted him as a fool, a man undone by a fleeting romance. Stocks plummeted, investors fled, and his once impeccable reputation was trampled in the mud. Yet through the chaos, Clara remained his anchor. They retreated to a small apartment in the city's quieter outskirts, a modest space with creaky floors and peeling paint, a world apart from the opulent penthouses Leonardo once called home. But within those walls, something new blossomed. They cooked meals together, laughing over burnt attempts at pasta. They sat on the tiny balcony, sharing dreams under the stars. They found joy in simplicity, unshackled from the weight of wealth. One evening, as the sun dipped below the skyline, Clara turned to him, her eyes soft with worry. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You've given up so much, your company, your legacy." Leonardo smiled, taking her hand in his. "I've gained more than I ever had," he said. "I was a prisoner to that life, lonely, hollow. Now I have you, and that's worth everything." Clara's heart swelled, but peace was fleeting. Marco's threats lingered like a storm cloud, his silence more ominous than his words. She knew he wouldn't stop, not until he'd drawn blood. "I need to face him," she told Leonardo one morning, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her. "I can't keep running." "Not alone," Leonardo insisted, his jaw tightening. "We do this together." They arranged to meet Marco in a public park, the open space a shield against his unpredictability. When they arrived, he was waiting on a bench, his lean frame slouched, his eyes glinting with malice. "The happy couple," he sneered, rising to his feet. "Come to beg me to keep quiet." Clara stepped forward, her chin high. "I'm not afraid of you, Marco. Whatever you think you have on me, it's not enough to break us." His smirk widened, venomous. "Oh, but it is. I've got proof you were negligent with that girl, Lily. You made a mistake and she died because of it." Clara's breath caught, memories of that night flooding back. The monitors beeping, Lily's small hand in hers, the frantic rush to save her. "That's a lie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I did everything I could." "Did you?" Marco taunted, stepping closer. "Or did you miss something? The press will love it, hero nurse a fraud." Leonardo moved between them, his presence a wall of strength. "Enough," he said, his voice cutting like steel. "You're bluffing. If you had evidence, you'd have sold it already. You're desperate and it's pathetic." Marco's grin faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Clara seized the opening. "You've got nothing," she said, her voice steadying. "You're trying to scare me into paying you, but it won't work. We're done with you." Rage twisted Marco's features, but before he could retort, Leonardo pulled out his phone. "I've recorded every word," he said calmly. "Come near us again and this goes to the police." Marco's bravado crumbled. With a final glare, he slunk away, defeated. Clara exhaled, her body sagging as the tension drained from her. "It's over," she whispered, turning to Leonardo. He pulled her into his arms, his voice a murmur against her hair. "Yes, it's over." In the months that followed, they rebuilt their lives from the ashes. Leonardo, with his business savvy, and Clara, with her heart for service, poured their energy into a new dream, a community health clinic in a neglected neighborhood. It was Clara's vision made real, a place of healing, of second chances. Leonardo found purpose in it, a redemption for the years he'd spent chasing profit over people. The day of the clinic's opening was a triumph. They stood together outside the modest building, its fresh paint gleaming under the sun. A crowd gathered, locals, volunteers, a few reporters who'd softened their tune. Clara's hands trembled as she held the oversized scissors, her eyes brimming with tears of joy. "This is for Lily," she whispered to herself, then cut the ribbon. Cheers erupted and Leonardo's arm slipped around her, his pride palpable. "We did it," he murmured. "Together." But the moment was interrupted. A voice sliced through the noise, Marco's, sharp and venomous. "Congratulations," he called, stepping from the crowd. "But they deserve to know the truth about you, Clara." Her heart stopped, fear surging anew. Before she could respond, Leonardo stepped forward, his voice booming. "Enough," he said. "Clara's the most honest, caring person I know. Whatever lies you're spinning, they won't stick. We've faced worse than you and we're stronger for it." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling as security moved in, escorting Marco away. Clara turned to Leonardo, gratitude flooding her. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick. He brushed a strand of hair from her face, his smile soft. "Always." That night they stood on their balcony, the city lights a tapestry below. Clara leaned into Leonardo's embrace, the warmth of his arms a balm to her soul. "I never thought I'd find love like this," she said, her voice barely audible. "After everything, Lily nursing, the shame, I thought I was too broken." Leonardo tilted her chin up, his eyes shining with emotion. "Neither did I," he admitted. "I was lost in a world of power and control, blind to what mattered, but you saved me in more ways than one. I'm grateful every day for you." Their lips met, a kiss that held the weight of their journey, pain, redemption, and an unbreakable bond. As they pulled apart, the city stretched out before them, a canvas of possibility. In the end, it wasn't about wealth or status. It was about finding someone who saw through your scars, who loved you despite your past, and who stood with you against the storms. We'd lost so much, but we'd found each other, and that was enough. If you enjoyed this story, check out another video with an even more amazing tale. There's always something exciting waiting for you on our channel. And don't forget, more wonderful stories are coming soon. Hit the subscribe button so you won't miss out on any of our upcoming adventures.